Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, here in Santa Clara, California, at day 3 of Cloud Expo, Silicon Valley. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening if you're following this out there on the World Wide Web. Good afternoon, Your Excellency. That's because my wife is watching. Now, guys, virtualization, they think I'm joking. I'll tell you later why I have to say that. Virtualization and cloud computing is one of the things we want to look at this morning. So obviously we've got experts with us. We have 4 of them. I'm going to ask them to self-introduce because, one, I can't possibly remember their names at my age. Scott.
Listen, thank you, Jeremy. My name is Scott Morrison. I'm the CTO and Chief Architect of a company called Layer 7 Technologies based up in Vancouver. And in fact, we're exhibitors here, so I'd encourage you to come down and talk to us a little bit. We're actually doing work in securing and managing clouds and giving you, as a customer of cloud providers, the access safely and securely into clouds. And what I want to talk about today with Jeremy and this very esteemed panel is that whole idea of virtualization in the cloud and where those come together. Because if you think about it, we've got 2 very distinct things. We've got virtualization, which we've known for many years. We've got cloud, which we're getting to know. And somewhere in the middle, you get this funny Venn diagram. It's a little blurry. And hopefully by the end of this panel, that'll be a little less blurry, and we'll have a pretty good idea of where that overlap is.
We'll ask the audience. Treb.
Hi, I'm Treb Ryan. I'm with OpSource. OpSource is an actual cloud provider. We provide public cloud services, traditionally through software companies such as Adobe or Taleo. These days, directly to enterprises or through SIs and VARs. It is interesting to see this cloud versus virtualization, especially when you consider that virtualization is often server-focused. But the term cloud comes from the network. It was the drawing at the top that represented the internet and the network, and obviously closely tied together, but in our mind, 2 very distinct items, not only in what they do, but how people think about them and how they use them.
Right, well that's the distinction that we'll try and leave the audience with, also out there on the World Wide Web. John Shende is next up.
Hi, good morning. My name is John Shende. I'm the Director of IT Services of an outfit in South Florida called EBSL Technologies. We work with small and medium enterprises. Our job, or my job, is to ensure that we strike a perfect balance between vendors and the customers to ensure that everybody is happy. And it's great that Trev mentioned that virtualization aspect, because in my world, security and forensics is a big thing. And there's an extremely important distinction between the hardware aspect and the software aspect, and I'm sure we're going to discuss.
You can bet your life on it.
Yes.
Dave.
My name is David Rokita. I'm with Hexagrid Computing, St. Louis, Missouri. I'm a member of the founding team. I'm the chief architect for Hexagrid. And what Hexagrid does is we really try to align cloud computing solutions with the existing supply chains that are either in service provider space or the enterprise space. And as far as cloud is concerned, to me the cloud is centered around the delivery and consumption mechanisms of computing resources.
Aha, a sudden end. Now here's the thing. I think it was Louis Armstrong, was it not, who was always rumored to have said, when asked what rhythm was, that if I have to tell you, you wouldn't understand. Do you remember that? Now, I think I'm hearing the same thing, sometimes, never at Cloud Expo, admittedly, but out there on the blogosphere, particularly about cloud computing and about virtualization, as if it's some high priesthood, and if you have to ask, then really you shouldn't be in the space. Now that's not fair. Scott, I know you're a Democrat, not a Democrat politically, but you believe, you're a populist, let's call it. A populist. So, yeah, this is the wrong state to go there. So,
wrong country.
What about that? Have these 2 technologies somehow drifted into some kind of priesthood status? You're only allowed to know that they're hot, and then you must leave it to us, the engineers, the infrastructure geniuses, and it's too complicated for mere CEOs to understand. Is that a problem still?
I think it is to a certain extent, insofar as any new technology, we automatically, as technologists, pull it into ourselves and try to really own that. And cloud is no different than that. I mean, the thing about cloud is it's a very, very exciting sort of set of new technologies and approaches to actually delivering on-demand elastic services. So of course we're going to be excited about that. But here's the difference. Unlike a lot of trends of the last 25 years or something in computing. This one's got a bulletproof argument that you can go up and sit in front of a CIO or a CEO and say, here's what it's about in its business terms. And that's pretty simple. It's about a shift from the classic CapEx model of buying a lot of equipment, maintaining it, keeping it going over time, to just an on-demand model where you've got very predictable, understandable operational expenses. It's the old CapEx to OpEx thing. Those guys understand that. They see that in Business Week and they get captivated by the idea. Now, of course, behind that is some very, very good technology that pulls all of that together. So I think cloud is interesting in that, unlike many trends the last little while, this one, while we do kind of pull it into ourselves and we do hide it and say, oh, don't worry about this. This is very complicated. Don't worry your pretty little head about virtualization or anything like that. The truth is that the real driver for that is actually going to be from the executive suite. And that's what I think really excites me about that whole technology.
All right, so there's one take that maybe they don't need to know. We're abstracting away, so maybe the CE doesn't need to know. Treb, where are you on that?
Yeah, I think it's funny that we spend so much time, because I think anybody under the age of 25 or 30 not only understands what cloud is, they don't understand what not cloud is. They don't understand anything but. I mean, if I remember back the first time, I had a buddy who was one of the founders of Netscape, and they were showing me this browser on my best internet account, and I was able to pull up pictures from the Louvre, and it was just this amazing experience to suddenly be able to pull up pictures from the Louvre just sitting there in his apartment. Netscape hadn't gone public yet, right. and looking at something without signing up for an account, without doing anything. And that same kind of realization comes to me when I can now spin up a server or deploy storage. I'm an old sysadmin in 2 minutes out in an Amazon or OpSource with no wait, and immediately have a server available to me without talking to anybody, without putting that forward. Yet anybody who's grown up in those 15, 16, 17 years between when I looked at that picture of that Louvre and saw that server today, that's the way they think about technology. They don't think in terms of really even an underpinning. What is it? Are servers? Is it virtualized? It's not. If they need something, they can get it right away. They can get it anytime they want, as soon as they want it. And if they want it for a minute, they look at it for a minute and they're done with it. And that cloud, what we call that cloud generation of users who've used the internet, are changing the way people think about how technology is getting used in the enterprise. And when we say that we're going to convince the CIOs or convince the executives, I don't think we're going to have to convince the next generation of CIOs and executives. I think they're not going to accept any other types of solutions.
Interesting. Fighting talk. Do you agree with that, John?
Yeah, actually I do, because, in today's world, or in the C-suite, we have to think forward. And
the C-suite being the cloud suite, presumably.
Obviously the cloud suite as well. But executives need to think forward. The fears about security and compliance and so on, it will fall into place. Yeah, it may take a couple years, or it may take an extra month of time, but it will happen. And we need to put those fears aside, because like my esteemed colleague said, it is happening. It is here, it is now, and we need to put every fear and concerns behind us.
Well, I like Treb's way of saying it, because the idea that they're simply in the C-suite.
Absolutely.
They're not going to settle for anything less.
Absolutely.
So engineering will come behind and solve these problems.
Right.
That's really your contention.
And it's progression. We need to think forward. And in order to stay competitive, especially in the global climate, everybody needs to get on board. This is where we are, and this is where we're going to go.
Does that make sense, Dave? That resonate?
Yeah, it does. When we talk about cloud and whether or not CIOs or CEOs will accept it, I think back to my early days in IT, and everything we did day in and day out was to try to get to that model. But the problem is that the technological barriers were so high that you had to IT either had to be your core focus to give on IT on demand, or it was just too difficult to execute a cloud-like on-demand delivery model. Now that the technology is easily available, and you have to take your hats off to companies like Intel who have provided us the hardware virtualization, which now the economies are there that just about anybody can do this. And now it's really just a simple matter of the CIOs and the CEOs to go out there and weed through all the things that are available, the things that are available at the Cloud Expo, and to put them together to build their own cloud vision. But again, I mean, I really think these ideas have been here since the beginning of computing. And if you look at the old school mainframe days of computing, I mean, essentially, that's what they tried to achieve with that model. And somehow along the line, it got broken with all this distributed computing that we do. You know, it's a very exciting time because, I mean, every day I look at the market and I'm like, wow, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the things that I do today just were too difficult to do in the past.
And I'm going to spend some time, probably the rest of the discussion, poo-pooing virtualization in terms of cloud is something that's really not the end product for cloud and not the end product, not what people are actually buying when they buy cloud. But I want to highlight it because I think you hit a great point in that it is, though, a humongously key enabling technology for the cloud. Because what it did was it abstracted the complexity of all the underlying systems.
It's done all the groundwork.
In a way that we could then take server resources, the way we'd already doing with storage and network resources, and display that extremely consistently for configuration management. I mean, 15 years ago, we've been trying to, we had the front end tools to do this, but it'd go to write a server and it had a different card setup in that server and deploy a system out there, or the system, you know, different PCI bus speed. And that would crash the entire environment. And so that abstraction layer that virtualization offered is what allowed us to take servers and make them, you know, much more immediately available, much more consistent across the environment. It's not what the person actually is buying. In the end, again, when someone buys a cloud instance for infrastructure service, much less all applications and integration and all that other piece, they're getting a server. They're not getting virtualization, they're getting a server. They don't care what happened underneath, right. They didn't care if it's a physical or not. But it very much enabled guys like us who provide that technology a way to do that where it was just way too difficult before virtualization existed.
I wanted to add something to that as well based on the virtualization comment. I mean, it's great, it laid the groundwork. However, virtualization only touches a certain point, and then you build out further with the cloud where you're actually making use of internet symbols and internet protocols, and that's where the cloud differentiates itself. With virtualizations, you basically, you know, you rely on looking up data code based on symbol tables, as you guys know. However, when you're running a virtual environment, chances are you're not double checking the memory virtualization, or you're making an assumption that the memory virtualization backs up what's on the symbol tables, and that may not necessarily be the case.
Next question is a kind of an attention span question. So this is not self-defeating about Cloud Expo, but let's be honest, guys. You're vendors selling something, ultimately. You're technologists. Here we are in the perfect storm. You barely have to sell. People are racing to you for guidance about the cloud. What's going to happen when that sizzle dies? When the metaphor is a little, you know, cloud fatigue sets in. We're not going the Gartner route now. Never mind the disillusion. Just sort of, you know, okay, but weren't you saying that last year and the year before, and it's now about 2015? What words will you use, Scott? What you're actually supplying is better, more agile IT. Is there any danger that riding the cloud horse almost, you know, like think of Microsoft. They're going to be talking today, so are SAP. Oh my goodness, we're going to be very, very cloudy by the end of today, and that's a marvelous thing also for Cloud Expo. But is that going to lead to a sort of a hangover in 5 years' time where people say, but this was 2010, why are we still paying you the big bucks?
Oh, listen, absolutely. There's always a difference between the cutting edge idea that captivates everybody and gets everybody excited. And today it's cloud, you know, no question. I mean, the fact that it's 7:45 a.m., you know, we've got anybody in this audience says a lot to sort of the interest in cloud and that. But I find there's always, without question, a lag between that and a truly mature market. And the truly mature markets really are the boring ones. You know what's a surprisingly mature market right now? SOA. And SOA's dead, remember? You know, SOA was the thing that's yesterday's news. It's like, you know, people are just, oh, we were doing that a while ago. You know, nobody talks about SOA anymore. But the truth is, right now, SOA is the thing that you don't have to sell. Because people will come to you and say, I need that infrastructure. Yeah, it's boring. Yeah, it's yesterday's news. Yeah, we were doing it a long time ago. Yeah, it's dead. But the truth is we didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater there. There were some good ideas in SOA. And in fact, we're taking those out to the cloud in a lot of cases. And so what's happening is you get that lag where there's a general public meaning, of course, the community that buys things, understanding and acceptance of these ideas and that. And cloud will be like that. 5 years from now, we're not going to be talking about cloud. People won't see cloud.
But it'll
They'll
be
see
cloud.
air.
Cloud is dead, long live cloud. Yeah. I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not even, I think you're only at the very beginning in terms of how the cloud's going to permeate. It's like saying, hey, we saw that first desktop, and we knew eventually that would lead to client server and replace the mainframe, but it was still 18 years in between. And we're still very immature in that. And I tell a funny story about a good friend of mine who's the CIO of a large chip company here in the Valley. And he's been encouraging his team to use cloud for the most traditional use of cloud, which is test dev. So they could do, when they needed burstability in their test environments, and found out they hadn't been using it. And I asked, and when he discovered they hadn't been using it, because they were worried if they started using cloud that they would lose their jobs. And the comment being is, unless their job was physically lifting servers and putting them into racks, cloud, everything else that they do every day, configuring the systems, running the tests, wiping out systems and creating new ones, are still being done on the cloud just as if they were being done on physical servers. As a matter of fact, often in ways that are far more manual. I commented that one of the things that people loved about Amazon when it came out is it made servers hard again, and so anybody could just do it in a second. All new technology, it's why wireless is still popular. No one's been able to figure out how to set up a decent wireless network yet. And so you made it hard for them. And so when we think about what's going into cloud, we've only gotten the most basic, a server, a storage, now maybe a network, some levels of security. And the fact is, no one ever said to a company, this company needs a new server. They want some solutions built around this. And so we're just hitting the very early days. I think you'll see some fatigue just on cloud servers, or more just comfort with cloud infrastructure. But what's going to be exciting on this conference for next year and the year after are what are the solutions that are being built in the cloud that enable anything at hourly based building, anything with API access. Get above the server into the OSS models, get above the server, of course, into the application layer. And that we still have a long way to go on.
I like that 18 years. I fancy that.
The thing is with, server virtualization is built out into the cloud, but you don't necessarily need server virtualization. You could spin up infrastructure apps instead and actually get into the cloud that way. The end of the day, this amalgamation of technologies, it's all about a company and its revenues. When the big guys get together, they want to know, hey, how much is it going to cost me? And at the end, how much is it going to benefit my operations? And that's it, In order to stay competitive, company XYZ gets into the cloud, everybody will follow because they will, the pitches are cost savings. Yes, you will see that, but there are other things that goes with that.
From my perspective, infrastructure is kind of like an offensive line. If it's operating well, you don't talk about it. And I truly believe that when we reach that point to where cloud is no longer the biggest topic of conversation, it's because it's pervasive. I mean, we haven't even seen the real impact of cloud. I mean, this thing is about applications. And sure, we've got Facebooks, and sure, we have Salesforce.coms, but somebody is really, really going to tap into the power of cloud, and we've not seen it yet. And it's going to drive an entire new generation of innovation that's going to be built on these technologies.
Well, hold that thought, because let's go geographical for a moment. I don't know how geographically diverse your various companies are, but this is going on. Speaker yesterday was reminding us that China's already got 800 million people on the net. India only 80, I think, strangely. So, the great big lag behind. But what about cloud as a way of, say, the Eastern European economies, the countries without IT infrastructure? What about them? Is cloud also going to have some kind of geopolitical implication? A lot of brilliant programmers in that eastern tranche of Europe who would very happily be doing startups themselves instead of schlepping to Sandhill Road here. They could just get going, from what I understand, and maybe create a roaring sort of Eastern bloc tiger. Any interest in any of that?
Oh, absolutely, without question, I think. Because, you know, a lot of what we're talking about in cloud really just removes barriers, and it gives people, regardless of where their location is, access to very, very high volume and high capacity servers and things like that. That makes a big difference. I remember back in the beginning of my career, so this was, you know, like early 90s or something like that. I was working in a medical imaging group up in Vancouver in Canada. And we had a visiting scientist, a neurologist, up from Cuba. And he was, you know, talking about some of the things that they had to go through just to get equipment and that. And they would get kind of used equipment from the former Soviet Union, and it had gone through several generations by then. But they did some very, very interesting things because, and the reason was, you know, they still had some very good scientists and some very curious people that did whatever they could to try to push what little technology they had to the very limit of where they could get to. So it was very interesting because it said, I think, a lot about the general curiosity of people everywhere and that. But the problem was, of course, they didn't have access to the same kinds of things that, you know, we in the you know, modern Western world just take for granted all the time. The thing about cloud is it's different. It suddenly gives anybody access to, you know, those same kinds of technologies. And so in that sense, it's a tremendous leveler. Now, at the same time, of course, you get some very, very interesting things as you cross the political boundaries. The geography is easy. I mean, we solve the geography problems. A little extra latency, not a big deal. Politics, now that's tough. That's really tough. And I think we'll see more and more issues about access to, you know, certain kinds of resources, especially as you start to scale up on a massive, massive scale. You know, the big thing with China and its new supercomputer, I think, is very interesting. Because in some ways, supercomputers, you know, with that approach are kind of becoming, whatever. You know, we don't need to scale up that way when we can scale out. Think of how many iPads got sold in the last 6 months. Think of how much computing power that represents. Think of how much storage power that represents in terms of the overall storage in the whole world. When you actually start to run the numbers, you realize that this infusion that's happening from Mr. Jobs and his cronies over there in Cupertino, where it goes out on a mass scale to everybody in this room, suddenly has, you know, world-changing implications in terms of the compute power that it represents, in terms of CPU volume, in terms of storage. So the next big thing, we'll be trying to figure out how we can start to take advantage of that kind of thing. How we can kind of go back to almost the SETI at home sort of ad hoc approach to cloud and maybe virtualization as well.
Yeah, I'll take even a step down, even below the BRIC countries. We have discovered, especially as you get into public cloud, that there is a phenomenal knowledge and use of the cloud in the most developing of nations. Unfortunately, we've discovered that in our ongoing battle to ensure the cloud is used for straightforward purposes and not for criminal purposes.
Not so easy.
Yeah, I hate to say we've done so many different things to, you know, cloud's great. Anybody can use it any time for anything they want. And how do you keep that straight up? I hate to say that one of our, the last algorithm we put in place very simply does not allow users from a certain Southeast Asian nation to sign up at all. Because any legitimate purposes they were ever using it for was not was outweighed by every time we were putting them down to so they would stop trying to hack people's Facebook accounts. And but what it does indicate to you is that those regions are already using the cloud constantly. The capabilities. Matter of fact, I would hazard to guess there are quite a few users in developing who don't understand any other form of computing.
Right.
You know, who have a very low power access terminal with probably fairly low latency, whose entire world lives outside of what they're doing today. And I do think that as you go over time, the cloud will, in many ways, the way wireless has surpassed wired in those nations, become the predominant form of computing. We don't sell a lot in India or China, but we have a lot of customers buying from there. And what's made it really, we see all the day, especially India, for some reason we get a lot of signups from India, and maybe it's because we have some operations there. But the belief is it's very hard to sell anything for $1 million in an emerging nation, but it's a lot easier to sell 1 million things for $1. Yeah. And as a result, cloud very much fits into that element. You can't go sell them that big iron. They've never bought the big iron, but boy, you can sell them a lot of things at 3 cents an hour in those environments.
Just to play a little bit of devil's advocate. You know, it's great, you know, that we're going to get business and we're going to, you know, stimulate economies and revenue generation and so on. However, one key aspect that we need to keep in mind is the legal aspect.
Well, that's really what Scott was intimating as
because
well.
As a forensics researcher at Royal Holloway, one of the things that, you know, that was a key point of contention is, hey, listen, if someone commits a crime and we don't have jurisdictionary access to get into there to prosecute, then what? You know, data could be amalgamated in a position or in a place, and we can't get in there to complete an investigation. You know, so we need to ensure when we're getting into business with countries or companies that expand or evolve into the cloud, we need to have legal ramifications in place as well. You know,
but if we take that optimistic tone that we've taken throughout this panel, that will be taken care of. We're
Absolutely.
not quite sure when and how, but there are experts like yourselves, and there are, you know, every company has a vested interest. As Trevor's done, they might take an internal policy decision, and then externally some kind of policies. And
Yeah, we looked up the legal ramifications of like just kicking people off and what was the issues of the data, and finally just made a decision that there's been no defined areas there yet, as there have been more traditional internet deployments.
But it will
and we were just going to kick them off because they were against our acceptable use policy, and we weren't even going to tell them.
Yeah.
You know, no notification, no legal recourse. You just
gone.
can't sign up anymore.
You're
Goodbye.
Absolutely. You know, and within the cloud, GRC is something that's it's going. And I actually spoke to a company yesterday with their solutions. You know, you have your SACs, your SOX 404, your SAS-70, and you need to ensure that, you know, there are certain levels of compliance because we want to have uniformity. I mean, it's a global phenomenon, you know, and we all need to be accountable.
Well, say we. There's a cultural gulf there that might have to be crossed.
And as companies or as advocates, you know, I mean, they're doing the right things. You know, you take the steps. Someone does something that goes against policy, well, hey, there's a consequence.
Dave, anything going on in emerging nations with Hexagrid?
Well, absolutely. And, you know, we have pretty good exposure, you know, in India. And one of the things that we've found is that this cloud has renewed interest in infrastructure. It is literally driving infrastructure projects. And the thing that's interesting is that, you know, it's not necessarily a one-for-one because the companies that have had infrastructure also have aging infrastructure. The companies that are building infrastructure today are going to be on the bleeding edge of that infrastructure, so it may not necessarily be a country that's behind the curve for long. I mean, it's very, very easy for these companies, especially now that we know that, you know, network connectivity is going to go up exponentially here. We're right on the edge of it. And, you know, it's interesting to me that cloud is driving that. It's almost like a new, you know, a boom in internet services that we haven't seen since, you know, the internet first had its initial explosion.
Well, one thing is clear. They always say the future lies ahead. We've all agreed on that. It looks like it's going to be a cloudy one. It looks like there's going to be a lot more virtualization. Let us say thank you in the time-honored fashion to Dave Rokita, John Shende, John Shende, Treb Ryan, and Scott Morrison. Keynote is coming right up next, our early morning keynote, so do not move. Thank you again, gentlemen, and thank you, audience. I'm impressed. Let's applaud the audience.